Dr. Sage here. Today we're going to begin learning about evolution. By the end of this video, you should be able to describe natural selection, define adaptation, explain convergent and divergent evolution, describe homologous and vestigial structures, describe the lines of evidence for evolution, and discuss some of the misconceptions about the theory of evolution. So, to begin, when most people think about evolution, they think about Darwin. However, there was some research on a hypothesis of evolution before Darwin. In fact, another scientist named Lamarck hypothesized that species evolve through use and disuse of body parts and the inheritance of these then acquired characteristics. However, this is not accurate. For example, Lamarck believed that a giraffe, for example, as it was trying to reach the leaves that were higher up on the trees, its neck would stretch and grow longer in order to be able to reach those higher leaves. And then it would pass on that longer neck to its offspring. Okay, that's not what actually happens. Another analogy, let's say that you decided, all right, today I'm going to start doing weightlifting. And I'm going to be very diligent to become a weightlifter. And my partner is also going to become a weightlifter. And we're going to have a child. And then when that child is born, that child is going to pop out as an extremely buff baby. Okay, obviously you're probably very well aware that's not what happens. Okay, if you acquire characteristics during your lifetime, you don't pass those on to your progeny, to your kids. Okay, that's not how evolution works. But before Darwin, they thought that's how it worked. So Charles Darwin and Alfred Wallace wrote scientific papers on natural selection and presented them together in 1858. Charles Darwin published on the origin of species by means of natural selection in 1859. In this book, he made two main points. Species show descent with modification from common ancestors, and natural selection is a mechanism behind descent with modification. Darwin's work can explain the unity and diversity we see in life. Okay, what does that mean? If we look around this planet, we see there's a lot of diversity. And that's what most people notice is the diversity. Like, you can see very obviously that you are not the same as a mouse. A mouse is not the same as a fly is not the same as a worm is not the same as a bird. Okay, people very easily see the diversity, the differences. However, there is just as much, if not more, unity than there is diversity. There's a shocking amount of similarity among all the living things on this planet. The theory of evolution can explain how things can be both different and the same at the same time. As we go throughout this lecture, I'll explain to you how that works. But before I get into those details, let me explain a couple of the misconceptions about Darwin. First, people think that Darwin came up with the idea of evolution. Darwin did not discover or come up with the idea of evolution. The idea of evolution was around before Darwin's time. In fact, that other scientist I mentioned, Lamarck, he published his hypothesis on evolution the year that Darwin was born. So, Darwin was a baby. Darwin didn't come up with the idea of evolution. So if Darwin didn't discover evolution, why is he so famous? Because what Darwin discovered is how evolution happens. Okay, and that's natural selection. Darwin discovered the way that evolution works, which is through natural selection. Okay, the second thing that everybody gets wrong about Darwin, and it's going to seem like I'm being nitpicky, but everyone says the name of his book wrong. Everyone says the name of his book is On the Origin of Species. Okay, that's not the name of his book. The name of his book is On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection. And that second part that everybody leaves out is actually the important part. That's what Darwin actually discovered. How evolution happens. How does it happen? Through natural selection. Okay, so Darwin was traveling around the planet and making observations about the living organisms and deceased organisms that are on this planet. Observation is a key skill of a scientist. Okay, all scientists need to be able to observe things. So, for example, as Darwin was traveling around this planet, he observed that individuals in a population vary in their traits, and many of these traits are heritable. He observed that while traveling throughout the entire world. You can observe that yourself just looking at the people in the room with you. Okay, we are a population of humans. We vary in our traits, and these traits are inheritable. You can pass them from one generation to the next. Okay, some of us have blue eyes, some have brown eyes, some have green eyes. Some have black hair, brown hair, blonde hair, red hair. Okay, and you can pass those traits on. Okay, you got black hair from your parents. You pass blue eyes on to your kids. So Darwin made that observation. You can make this exact same observation very easily. Second thing that Darwin observed is that more offspring are produced than survive. So there's going to end up being competition between them. Okay, now this is not talking about like mice living protected in a lab. This is talking about like wild field mice, mice living out in the wild. Okay, out in the wild, more mice are born than are going to survive. Most of them will not survive long enough to have baby mice of their own. So because of that, they're going to end up competing with each other. They're going to compete for resources. For example, food. There's not enough food out in nature to feed all the baby mice that could be born. Well, if one little mouse comes along and finds that piece of food and eats it, okay, it survives for the day, but then that food's not there for the next mouse to come along, so it dies. Okay, so they're going to compete with each other for resources like food. They're also going to compete with each other for resources like shelter from predators. There are things that want to eat mice. Okay, a hawk wants to eat a mouse. Okay, well, if this mouse finds a nice little hiding spot so the hawk can't see it, okay, it's protected. But now that hiding spot is taken up, so the next mouse can't hide and the hawk can get that mouse. Okay, so they're going to be competing with each other. He observed this. If you really want to, you can go out into nature and you can observe this yourself. Third thing you notice is that species generally suit their environment. It seems like things are very well adapted for where they happen to be living. For example, again, go out, let's say you take a walk out in the woods in Florida. And as you're walking through the woods in Florida, let's say along hops a little bunny rabbit. Okay, and that little bunny rabbit is almost guaranteed it's going to have brown fur. Why? Because the brown fur very nicely matches the leaf litter on the ground of the woods of Florida. In other words, it makes it harder to see that rabbit. Why does that matter? Because rabbits have predators. Okay, hawks want to eat rabbits. Okay, well, that brown rabbit can hide better from that hawk. Now, let's say you go take a walk up in Alaska, where it's very snowy, and along hops a little bunny rabbit. That bunny rabbit is not going to have brown fur, it's going to have white fur. Why? Because that white fur very nicely matches the snowy background. In other words, it hides better from predators. So Darwin made this observation, you can make the exact same observation. From these observations, Darwin inferred that individuals that are best suited to their environment are more likely to survive and reproduce. So over time, more individuals in the population will have the advantageous traits. In other words, if there's a white rabbit in Florida, it's going to stick out, be easily seen, and eaten by a predator. Then it can't pass on its genes for the white fur onto the next generation. Whereas that brown furred rabbit will easily hide. It's more likely to pass its genes on to the next generation. So over time, we have more and more brown furred rabbits in Florida, more and more white furred rabbits in Alaska. So evolution occurs as the unequal reproductive success of individuals. In other words, the environment selects for the propagation of beneficial traits. Darwin called this process natural selection. So that is all natural selection is. Okay, natural selection is not hypothetical. You can directly observe it happening. You can watch natural selection happening in real time. We have observed natural selection happening many, many times. But just to make sure that that made sense, let me explain natural selection once again in a figure. Okay, in order to have natural selection, there's a few things you need. First, you need a population. For example, we have this population of beetles here. Second, the population has to vary in some heritable trait. For example, these beetles, they could have darker shaded shells, more brown-like, or lighter shaded shells, more green-like. Okay, and they can pass that on to the next generation, just like you can pass on blue eyes to the next generation or brown eyes to the next generation. Okay, third, that population has to be living somewhere. In this case, this population of beetles is living in an area where it's a very green background, like they're living in a grassy area. Okay. Next, what you need is some selective pressure, something that's going to act upon that inheritable trait. In this case, that would be a bird. Why? Because birds like to eat beetles. Now, imagine for a second that you're a hungry bird and you're flying around trying to find some food. If you're flying around trying to find some food, you're not going to pass a piece of food that's easy to find in order to find a piece of food that's harder to find. Why? Because you're hungry. You don't want to starve to death. Okay. Well, in this green, grass-colored background, it's easier for that bird that's flying around to see those brown shaded beetles. It's harder to see the green shaded beetles. They hide better. So what that means is a higher percentage of the time, what's happening is that bird is eating the brown shaded beetles. Well, if this beetle has been eaten, it's dead, so it can't pass on its genes to the next generation. So over time, what happens is that population shifts to have less and less of the brown shaded beetles and more of the green shaded beetles. In other words, the beetles seem to be very well adapted for where they're living. These green shaded beetles are living in this green grassy background. Okay, why? Because they hide better from that predator, that bird. Now, let's say something happened. Let's say there was a drought. And because there was a drought, all the grass was dying off, so it turned to a brown color. In that case, the brown beetles hide better, whereas the green beetles stick out and they're more easily seen. Then the bird would more often eat the green beetles. So over time, that population would shift to be more and more brown shaded beetles and less green shaded beetles. In other words, suiting the environment that they're living in. Okay, that is all natural selection is. You can understand it with one figure. Okay, it's logical. It makes perfect sense if you think through it. It's observable. We've seen this happen many times. Okay, so it's not hypothetical. Natural selection happens. It's a fact, basically. Okay, all evolution is natural selection over a very large time scale. That's all evolution is. Okay, and we'll get into those details, what evolution is, and some examples of evolution, of the evidence for evolution as we go throughout this lecture today. But that's natural selection. Natural selection is just the way that evolution happens. Okay, so as Darwin was traveling around this planet, he observed organisms that seemed to be very well suited for their environment. For example, famously he studied the finch species in the Galapagos Islands, and he observed that their beak shape varies amongst these different finch species. He postulated that the beak of an ancestral species became adapted over time to equip the finches to acquire different food sources. For example, seed-eating birds tended to have very large, thick beaks. Okay, why? To better break open the seeds. Okay, kind of like this vice grips type lock that can very easily crush a seed. Okay, whereas the insect-eating birds tend to have spear-like beaks for stabbing their prey. Okay, that's more like needle-nose pliers. These different pliers will be used for different purposes, just like these different beaks are used for different purposes, cracking open seeds versus catching insects. Okay, so we're learning about natural selection, which is the way that evolution happens. But there's a related process called artificial selection. Okay, artificial selection is basically selection that humans have done, and we've been doing this for thousands of years. Okay, the food you eat, the crops you eat, like the banana you eat, okay, has been adapted over time by humans. Domesticated animals have been adapted over time by humans. What happens is we choose phenotypes that we want, like, for example, a larger and larger banana, so it gives us a more food source, and breed those together to creating hybrids that have larger and larger bananas over time. So that's what natural selection is. As an example of that, something you're probably not aware of, okay, these different types of crops you've probably heard of before, at least some of you have heard of before, they all come from the same plant. They've been adapted by humans over time. Okay, we took this plant here, wild mustard, and then we selected for different characteristics. For example, if we selected for large leaves, okay, well, that's where kale came from. If we selected for side buds, that's where we get Brussels sprouts from. we select for the tip buds, that's where cabbage came from. If we select for flowers and stems, that's where we got broccoli. And if we select just for stems, that's where we get, I don't know how to pronounce this food plant here. Okay, the point is, these different plants you might think of as being very different, they all came from the same plant. We as humans artificially selected it over time to get these different crops, be it cabbage or Brussels sprouts. That's artificial selection. Same thing happens in nature. And that's natural selection. So, what we're going to do is we're going to go over some of the evidence for evolution. There's an overwhelming, enormous amount of evidence for evolution demonstrating evolution. Okay, we don't have time to cover all of it in this class, and frankly, some of it is things you need to take some higher level courses to better understand. Like, for example, the molecular evidence of evolution, comparing protein sequences or DNA sequences, which I'll talk a little bit about. But if you want to find more evidence, go on and take another course, a whole course on evolution, instead of this brief introduction, which is just a couple chapters on evolution. We'll cover a little bit of the evidence, just so you have a basic idea. Okay, so types of evidence for evolution, and then I'll explain these in the next few lecture slides, is divergent versus convergent evolution, the fossil record, homologous structures, vestigial structures, biogeography, molecular biology, and direct observation. Observing evolution happen directly. So, first type is divergent evolution. Sometimes evolution gives rise to groups of organisms that become tremendously different from each other. We call two species that evolve in diverse directions from a common point divergent evolution. An example of that is the finch species that Darwin found in the Galapagos Islands. Those different finch species evolved from a common ancestor, but over time they become adapted to different food sources, so they diverged away from each other. That's divergent evolution. Another example is convergent evolution. Convergent evolution is where similar traits evolve independently in species that do not share a recent common ancestor. For example, the white winter coat of the Arctic fox and the plumage of this bird are adaptations to their environments. Okay, they both have this white color to them. Now that similarity is not because of a recent common ancestor, but rather because of similar selective pressures. In other words, they both hide well from predators. It's harder for predators to see them. So independently, similar phenotypes will evolve in distantly related species due to the same evolutionary pressures. They're both trying to hide from predators. That's convergent evolution. Similarity is not due to a recent common ancestor. More evidence of evolution is the fossil record. And frankly, when most people think about evolution, that's the way they think about it, is fossils. Okay? There's an enormous amount of evolution besides fossils. People think about fossils most common because that's what was around back in Darwin's time. That was one of the types of evidence in Darwin's time. But we have much more recent forms of evidence besides the fossils. But fossils still serve as a form of evidence for evolution. Fossils provide solid evidence that organisms from the past are not the same as organisms living today, and fossils show a progression of evolution. For example, this photo is a display from the Museum of Natural History, the Smithsonian in Washington, D.C., that shows 76 different fossil skulls from 15 different species of hominids, okay, which are the human ancestors. Okay, and this is kind of showing you the evolutionary progression, which is more complicated than this, but we'll go into that in a later chapter of some of these species. And some other things you've heard of before. Obviously, you heard about humans, Homo sapiens. You probably heard about Neanderthals, a closely related species, but there are other species that were human-like but not humans. Okay, more evidence of evolution would be homologous structures. All right, so for a second, I want you to imagine that right now, you are not taking a biology class. Right now, what you're taking is an engineering class. And myself, as your engineering professor, what I ask you to do for homework tonight is I want you to go home and I want you to design, to engineer from scratch, an arm that's meant for lifting, and a leg that's meant for walking, and a wing that's meant for flying, and a flipper that's meant for swimming. Okay. as an engineer, if you were going to design those 4 different structures, you would design them differently. Why? Because the physics of lifting is very different than the physics of walking or the physics of flying. So since they work differently, you would design them differently. But if you look at those 4 appendages, they all have the same basic underlying structure. There's 1 bone here, 2 bones here, set of wrist bones, set of hand bones, set of finger bones. Okay, they're the same bones. Be it in an arm, 1 bone, 2 bones, wrist, hand. A leg, 1 bone, 2 bones, wrist, hand. A wing, or a flipper. They're all the same set of bones. They've just become adapted over time to serve different purposes. Okay, imagine you're an organism that's transitioning from walking on the land to swimming in the oceans. In that case, it would be beneficial for those finger bones to grow longer and longer so you can get a big flipper to help yourself swim through the oceans. Okay, those finger bones growing longer and longer is the exact same idea as the shade of the beetle shell is getting darker and darker over time. It's just a much larger time scale, but the idea is exactly the same. There is no reason to have the same underlying structure in these 4 different limbs, except that they all evolved from an organism that had that basic bone structure. Okay, more evidence for evolution. Okay, speaking of this organism here, this whale. Okay, I think you all know what a whale is. We've all heard about whales before. They're those large creatures that live in the oceans. Most of you are probably also aware that a whale is a mammal. It's not a fish. Okay, it breathes air. It's warm-blooded, whereas most fish are cold-blooded. It produces milk. It has hair. Okay, whales are mammals. They are not a fish. Okay, now you're probably also very aware that whales are those large organisms that are swimming through the oceans. As they're swimming through the oceans, whales don't walk. Whales have no use for legs. They don't walk. However, if you look at the skeleton of a whale, it has the remnants of legs. It has a bit of its pelvis and its femur left over. These bones do nothing. They're absolutely useless for the whale. Its pelvis bone isn't even attached to the spinal column anymore, like your pelvis bone is attached to your spinal column. So if they're useless, because whales don't walk, why are they there? Why? Because a whale, being a mammal, evolved from something that used to walk on the land. Over time, it became a disadvantage to have that leg hanging there as you're trying to swim through the oceans. So over time, that leg started to get shorter and shorter, started to lose that leg, okay? Just like the flipper's getting longer and longer, or the beetle shell's getting darker and darker over time. But it hasn't been completely selected against yet. That's why you can find the remnants of the pelvis and the femur. Okay, this is another type of evidence which is called vestigial structures. Okay, vestigial structures are structures that the organism doesn't have a use for, but they are useful in the ancestor of that organism. Other evidence for evolution is biogeography. Biogeography, which is the development and presence of species based upon location. Okay, the easiest way to think about this is if you think about Australia. Australia, okay, that island separated very far from most of the other continents. Australia has a large proportion of its mammals that are marsupials. Okay, like, for example, kangaroo. That's where you have that little pouch where the organism completes development in the pouch, okay, out of not living inside. Versus placental mammals like us, where we complete development inside the placenta. Okay. Why does Australia have a large percentage of marsupials, whereas North America has very, very few marsupials? Because over time, those land masses became separated from each other and evolved differently. Australia tend to evolve marsupials, North America tend to evolve placental mammals. More recent evidence for evolution would be molecular biology. This is something that Darwin never could have known about because it was way before it was discovered. Okay, we can compare DNA of different species, the sequence of the base pairs, the letters A, T, C, G. We can also compare the sequence of proteins. By comparing the sequence of DNA and proteins, we can observe the evidence for evolution. Species that are more evolutionary, closely related to each other, have more similar sequences. Species that are more divergent from each other on an evolutionary sense have more disparate or different sequences. Okay, here's an example of that. I looked up my favorite gene, okay, FOXO. FOXO is probably related to aging, that's why it's my favorite gene. But I looked up this gene in humans and in salmon. Okay, and we can compare the DNA sequence of this gene because these species both have this same gene. They've just evolved a little bit separately over time. Okay, basically humans and salmon share about 50% of the DNA is identical for this particular gene. And like here's some of the DNA sequence for that gene. You can see wherever the DNA matches, you have little asterisks here, like it's A in both humans and salmon. It's C in both humans and salmon here. Where it doesn't match, there's no asterisks, okay? So you can see that, about half of the gene is the same between humans and salmon. Now let's compare it to something that's a little more similar to us, okay? Instead of a fish, a mammal, a mouse. Okay, about 88% of the DNA is identical between humans and mice for this particular gene. And you can see if you compare, just look at these asterisks down here, there's a lot more of them between the human and the mouse than between the human and the salmon. Why? Because we're more closely related to mice than we are to fish. Something that's even more closely related to us, a bush baby, which is a primate, like we're a primate. Okay, 92% of the DNA is identical for this particular gene between humans and primates. Okay, you can see there's a lot less of the regions that don't have asterisks. Okay, something that's even much more closely related to us, a chimpanzee. Okay, 99% of the DNA is identical in this gene between humans and chimpanzees. So what this is showing us is we can compare the DNA sequences for different genes, and we can see how closely related organisms are to each other. Human and chimps are much more closely related than a human and a fish. Another form of evidence for evolution is direct observation. Okay, we directly observe evolution happening. One of the easiest way to do this is by observing evolution within bacteria. Why is it much easier to see in bacteria directly than in like humans directly or mice directly? Because bacteria reproduce very rapidly. You can go through a generation in about 3 hours. So what that means is you can go through many generations within a couple of weeks. Okay, if you were to try to go through that many generations in a mouse, okay, it would take centuries. So it's much easier for us to directly observe evolution in an organism that has a very quick turnover and from one generation to the next. One common example of this is something you might have heard of before, which is MRSA. MRSA stands for methicillin-resistant Staphylococcus aureus. Okay, Staph aureus is a bacteria that infects humans. Okay, MRSA is one that's become resistant to some antibiotics we use to try to kill off or fight off this bacteria infection in humans. Okay, Staph aureus became resistant to penicillin in 1945, which is just 2 years after we started using penicillin. It then became resistant to methicillin in 1961, which was again just 2 years after we started using methicillin. In other words, we started using selective pressure on the bacteria. We started using antibiotics to try to kill off the bacteria, just like the bird eating the brown shaded beetles. What happens? More green shaded beetles live. Okay, we use antibiotics to try to kill off these bacteria. What happens? The bacteria that happen to be resistant to that antibiotic happen to live. So there's an enormous, overwhelming amount of evidence for evolution. I've just barely scratched the surface talking about it. But some examples of evidence for evolution are direct observation. You can reproduce evolution in the lab, or you can document it in nature. And then also through things like bacteriology, like that MRSA I was just talking about a second ago, or virology, immunology, or pest control, like mosquito populations, for example, we observe evolution happening. The fossil record, molecular evidence, which is DNA and protein sequences. Something I didn't talk about today, embryology and development. Biogeography, which is different organisms living on different parts of the planet. Comparative anatomy, homology and vestigial organisms. and something I didn't talk about, which is the predictive power of evolution. So since evolution is a theory, it can make predictions, and we can test those predictions. For example, and we'll talk about this later in the semester most likely, but there was a prediction that there should be a transitional species between the organisms that lived in the ocean and the organisms that started to walk on the land. We predicted it should exist. We predicted what it should look like, kind of a mix of the two, a fish and a land-walking mammal. And we predicted when it should have been living and what region of the planet it should have been found in. So what did the scientists do? They went and they dug in the earth. It's in the region where it should have been found, and they dug down to the strata, the layer at which it should have been found based on how long ago that was in our past. And what did they find? They found that organism they predicted to find. Evolution, since it's a theory, can form predictions. We can test those predictions, and those predictions have held true. Now, there's a lot of misconceptions about evolution. First misconception is that evolution is just a theory. Okay, as I explained in a prior lecture, if somebody says something is just a theory, they do not understand what the word theory means. When somebody says something is only a theory or just a theory, what they mean to say is something is a hypothesis. A hypothesis is your best guess, is what you think is happening. That's not what a theory is. A theory is a very well tested, it's already been tested, explanation for a set of results. Also, somebody will say something is only a theory. It's not a fact. It's only a theory. It hasn't been proven. Again, they don't understand what the word theory means. No theory has ever been proven. No theory will ever be proven in science. Gravity is a theory. It will forever and always remain a theory. A theory is as big as it gets in science. There's nothing above a theory. A theory is as big as it gets. Okay, by the time something becomes a theory, it has hundreds of thousands of pieces of evidence supporting it. Okay. So get rid of that idea that evolution is just a theory, because if you say just a theory, it shows you don't know what the word theory means, at least not the scientific definition of the word theory. Second misconception is that individuals evolve. An individual does not evolve, a population evolves. You start weightlifting, you're not going to have a buff baby. Okay, that's not the way it works. Populations evolve, individuals evolve, do not evolve. Third misconception is that evolution explains the origin of life. Okay, evolution explains how organisms change over time, not how organisms originally came about. Another misconception is that organisms evolve on purpose. It's not like that giraffe tries to grow a longer and longer neck. It's not like the beetles are like, oh shit, there's a bird trying to eat me, I better change my shell to be brown instead of green. It's not the way it works. The beetle happens to be born with a green shell or a brown shell, and then nature selects for one of those over the other. Okay, it's not like it evolves on purpose to one or the other. So, what I'd like you to do next is watch a couple of other videos that showcase some more evidence for evolution. Okay, this would be Evolution is a Thing by Crash Course Biology, and What is the Evidence for Evolution by Stated Clearly. Again, this just shows a little bit more of the evidence for evolution. In the next video I'm going to make, we're going to talk about the formation of new species, how we actually get new species evolving. But until then, this has been Dr. Sage.